many tasks, but not all, are more productive in working from home. So there's a massive positive. The reduced levels of stress has a negative side as well, because we'll go on to the psychological safety element in a minute. But there are also some benefits in terms of presenteeism. You know, that people don't feel that they need to be under the watchful eye of their management while they're working from home. And that has a converse side, which we'll come on to, which is how management actually feel comfortable with their staff being away. But on the negative side, I think they're maintaining a corporate culture and identity is more challenging when people are out of sight and out of mind, and that will throw up a number of challenges, which I'll finish off on. It's difficult to promote a team ethic, especially when you have new joiners and staff turnover. It exacerbates the problem. We have issues of stress which are caused, you know, on the other side, the flip side of the commute to work and being in the office is being isolated, stresses caused by financial issues as a result of being on furlough, etc. And of course, people have been noted to show that the distinction between being on duty at work and off duty at home is very blurred when one is working from home. And then finally, on the negative side, there's been a more pronounced effect on lower socioeconomic groups, the less well off, those with less space around them, less comfortable working environment, and absence of open space, etc., to be able to stretch themselves out into. And so I think where this will lead to is there will have to be a focus on strong leadership, so defining the purpose of companies, what people's role is, what the company's role is, has a beneficial effect, clear messages and tone from the top in terms of what the culture is and how it should be enacted in the company. And then a second point, I distinguish management from leadership, because I think this will be a real test for management, the oversight of your staff. It's all too easy to forget personal issues when you're interacting within an office environment and able to dip in and out of a person's work very quickly. But I think management will have to be more systematic to ensure that it covers both hard data, i.e. profit and loss, productivity, as well as soft issues such as well-being and psychological safety, motivation of staff as well. Trust is going to have to be built in order for the future world to work properly, however that finally shapes out. And all of that will have to be backed out by relevant controls, which may well have to be more technically better in order to cope with remote issues, and more focused, basically. So that would be my summary.
Okay, no, look, I think that's interesting, and Vicky, I'll come to you in a second on the same question. I mean, my observations for what that's worth really is I think that we've seen some great examples of companies and individual managers responding supremely well, who have done the right thing, who have been there for their staff and have understood the change in dynamic. I think we've also seen, interestingly, some managers who have been less capable and leaders who've been less capable of handling that. I'm struck particularly by the fact that the largest selling pieces of software at the moment is one, video calling for obvious reasons, but the second is spyware. And there are a lot of people who are developing some pretty sinister stuff, I would argue, that probably belongs in North Korea as opposed to in a Western culture, where there is severe monitoring of people and kind of needing to request permission to go for toilet breaks. So I see very much that we've had a doubling down, almost those people that are good with people, good at that management side of it, have really flourished. I think there's been an interesting shift the other way. And as we go back into the into a sort of slightly more hybrid state. I think it's going to be interesting to see which way firms go as they try and adopt those challenges. And I think from a risk perspective, this poses some interesting pieces, because not supervising people is a risk, but equally over supervising them presents a risk as well. And how one strikes that balance, I think, is interesting. And that's an argument for the regulators as well as for firms, because one of the regulatory tools is we'll come and see you. That becomes a little bit harder when coming to see you involves doorstepping people in their private homes. Now, the regulator could theoretically do that, but I think that's interesting. Clearly, they can use electronic surveillance, but that's an interesting challenge for them as well. Vicky, your thoughts?
So probably echo what has already been said, but I think from my perspective, the things that truly matter have been considerably amplified. And I think going back to those basics is very helpful. And I think most people have a far better understanding of either what their work ethic is or what they want to achieve, and how that actually then feeds through to how they both work and also how they play. I heard it described very nicely the other day as working at home is like sucking a sweet with a wrapper on. It's the same taste, but it's not so much fun. So everybody may have a different view as to how fun that working is, but I think it does bode that when you're not necessarily engaging with your all of your colleagues, whether it be in the first, second, or third line, actually does that make your life more interesting, or does it just become too stagnant? And so that variety, I think, still can be missing. And I'm talking work life as opposed to outside of sort of family life, etc. I think there's also that requirement that separation shouldn't be an excuse for poor risk culture, and I think there is that can happen. So I didn't see it, I didn't realize it, I wasn't checking, etc., because it wasn't in front of me. And I think there's a natural propensity to go down that route, which shouldn't clearly be encouraged. So that would be my first sort of views on that.
Interesting. And look, the phrase "new normal" is being used as much as unprecedented. So I think we should probably just quickly explore what's the sort of general perspective on, are we going, what do we think is going to stick from the new world, and what do we think is going to be a return to old world? Terry, thoughts on that?
And Christian, before you add to the question from something that has been raised from the audience, which is an announcement of one of the large banks that they will not return to office until 2021. And the question being, is it something that's going to be permanent in the minds of the panelists?
Fabulous. We'll throw that one straight to Terry as well. Thank you for that.
I missed some of that. It was the question about, is it more likely that we'll be going back in 2021 from a certain bank?
So the question was, somebody's announced that they're not going to be doing that. So several large firms have said that they will not be returning to the office until 2021. So it was an additional point for that broader, what do we think the world looks like now?
Yeah, a common message is that there will be a kind of phased approach between now and the end of the year and the beginning of the next year, and how quickly people will move people in those phases varies quite a lot. So some types of management want more people in more quickly, others are more flexible and less urgent about it. I think what will come out, the new normal, which is an overused phrase, I think what will come out of this event is a much more nuanced view of how we work. I expect people will work at home more than they did before the crisis, partly because I know a number of big institutions which didn't even allow it before the crisis, and they've been forced to learn by this event. But I think people will pick and choose more about when they will work at home. I think many people, for the reasons mentioned earlier, would like to eliminate things like commuting as much as they can, and so will choose their moments to be in the office and the things which are most effective in the office. And that might be a brainstorming session or a team meeting or a few meetings which lead up to the monthly drink in the cafe or the pub, whichever you choose. But it'll be much more thoughtfully adopted, I expect. But at the bottom of my belief is humans are social animals, and for us to retain our team spirit, our corporate ethic, and we will need to see each other quite regularly in order to learn from each other and to teach each other as well.
And I mean, I think there's some interesting dynamics actually. If we look at the structure and the way the organizations run themselves, there are certain things that come from traditional thinking that's never really been challenged. So if I look at the way meetings are run, one of the reasons that one has hour-long meetings, if not longer, is you are getting people to turn up to a physical space, and to get them to turn up to any less than that would be insulting. Whereas digitally, you can jump in and out of meetings much more easily because you're not physically moving. So I think there's a huge opportunity here for not just the physical space to be redefined and the sort of physical, what we spend our time doing, but actually some of the fundamental structures of the way organizations are run, processes that come from a physical world. I mean, if you, ignoring the potentially sexist angles on this, the word chairman, that suggests sitting in a chair around a boardroom table. And I think there's much in our vocabulary and structures that comes from traditional thinking, which is things have to be done in a physical space. And offices are signs of stature, and open plan offices clearly no longer as sensible as if indeed they ever were. So I think there's a lot that's going to change in terms of the language we use and the way that we think about some of these processes that goes, I think, far beyond just the how many days a week am I going to go to the office. So I foresee some quite interesting times. Vicky, if we look at the risk functions, clearly they are going to have to respond and are responding to this particular dynamic. And it's, you'd never say that we were living in a sort of static world, but clearly there is a heck of a lot more uncertainty and volatility than there was a few months ago from the perspective of all the elements one is trying to observe and help control. What is your perspective on the sort of structuring and thinking that risk teams, both for their own kind of organizational piece, but also in terms of what it is they are responsible for managing?
Yeah, no, so if I could just comment on the previous question just very quickly, actually, because I think so I used to work in Australia, and I was based in Melbourne, and we had teams across Sydney, Adelaide, etc. And actually the video call and the lack of physical presence has been well entrenched across those areas, and also I think where firms, they're all already working in the global environment. And if you think of the fintechs, etc., everything is done on Teams, on video calls, and has been for some period of time. And so I think it will be some of that. The new norm isn't new at all. That has always been, or has been, the case for the last few years. So I think in some cases firms are getting onto that, and in some cases they will excel because they are already there. So that was just a point off the back of that piece.
Okay, two questions. One maybe for you and one maybe for Christian on the back of some things from the audience. One is, you mentioned interacting with firms and clients and staff and different locations. We have GDPR. Are there any data privacy concerns or security concerns when you're talking about having to access or interact with data across multiple locations? And Christian, for you, one to consider in the right time would be, what does it mean for distribution, for oversight of customer delivery if you have staff not in a central location?
Vicky, do you want to take the first one, or?
Yeah, no, that's fine. So I'm not a GDPR expert, just to be clear on that up front, but in terms of sharing that data, and I think that's been the case when many people have been working at home. So it's not just across, the sharing across various jurisdictions and countries. It's also, when people are working from home and they have access to that data, whether it be medical or just client data, in order to hold and those relationships. I think that has been a very difficult one. Clearly, the GDPR regulations state whether you can or you cannot share various data across various jurisdictions, and there's some areas into which that data cannot flow at all, and others you have to have that enforced. Do I think people have followed those stringently throughout this last piece? I suspect not. So I think there probably will be repercussions from that, and it probably will be the hygiene factor where people should have done and didn't realise that they had done the wrong thing, and it might be just the simplicity of sharing people's numbers or etc. to get in touch, etc. I think the broader piece around patient access to patient data, etc. from home, I think will have been dealt with, and I know many cases that's why, for example, GPs are in on site, etc., so that they can have access, etc. But I think that will have caused the industry some issues where some people weren't being dealt with because that data wasn't available to those who were working from home, etc. So yes, I think there probably will be a GDPR issue because that should have been applied and probably hasn't been.
Yeah, actually, can I chip in? Because one interesting GDPR or data issue came up with the use of Zoom at the beginning of the pandemic, yes. Where if you use the free Zoom option, then Chinese servers are potentially used. So you have to be careful about which boxes you tick and which options you select and pay for in order to protect or to give proper protection under GDPR. And I expect that to probably be replicated in other systems as well.
Well, there was also the issue, wasn't there, up front, where there was a, what was it named, Zoom bombing, I think, and other various bombings, yeah. In the virtual sense, across a variety of different pieces. So I think the cyber matter that we haven't covered, there was a vast amount of that flowing through, and probably is, and some of it hasn't yet been understood properly. But the ability to do that was, I think, opened up far more for those who chose to do that.
And I think one of the challenges here is that when it starts from the legislation. Often the legislation won't have contemplated these sorts of scenarios. So it will have come with some very high-minded statements, thinking around a different world, which of course is probably isn't the legislator's problem. It suddenly becomes the regulators and the regulatees' problem. And I think one of the challenges there is adapting that piece and sort of to say, on the one hand, I think firms were stuck between a rock and a hard place because, do you want to continue to provide service to your clients? Yes. Does that mean that you are weighing up potentially, if you were thinking about this, you were weighing up GDPR concerns with client access concerns? And I think that's one of the challenges here, is that particularly we've got heavily codified regulation, and this is a point I make to people around their own risk management and compliance frameworks, is codification feels great because you've bottomed it out until you haven't, because something has changed, at which point massive loopholes and challenges can be created. And so I think what's interesting about a lot of these regulations is if you were to ask GDPR legislators, they would say, well, of course we meant it to cover all these scenarios, but actually that wasn't particularly contemplated. I don't think it was contemplated as a high risk in terms of the way the authorities imposed requirements on firms and looked at it, nor was it thought of from a firm's perspective. And so I think there are going to be a heck of a lot of firms that have breached rules, probably in many cases with the right intention, right, trying to deliver a bigger aim. And I think that's one of the challenges of the regulatory and risk landscape, is that there are sometimes going to be these contradictory forces, and that laws will apply in ways that weren't contemplated. And you can bet that consumers and anybody else that can is going to go after these loopholes. So I think there's a really interesting challenge to come, which is, possibly unfair in some respects in the industry. On the other hand, those are the rules of the game, and you should have been prepared for it. And I think this is the risk management challenge, is how does one go back and think about all the other things, where if one were to have another potentially unforeseen scenario, is have we really thought through what all these different regulations mean? Now that comes at a cost, and of course then you start to get into interesting territories of trade-offs. So I think it's a big challenge that's sort of facing everybody, and I'm not sure there's a simple answer apart from throwing more money at the problem, which clearly in the current climate isn't great either.
So I think, Christian, sorry if I can just comment on that. So I think one of the areas, so this will be the first time that we've been through sort of an end scenario analysis, and we've actually, we've fully been through that, and I know, if you look at, the ILAPs and the risk recovery plans and the ICAPs, etc., when you need to do, scenario analysis, we typically don't necessarily take them all very seriously, and the consultation advice would be, well, you have to have a pandemic in there or a macroeconomic factor in there, and everybody does, but grumble when that's being pulled together, because that's never going to happen, and now it has happened. And so just having that plan B and having a practical plan B, as opposed to a number of different management actions that would never have taken place or would never, and what we've done at the moment and what we've been through, we never would have considered potentially of going through, and I think a lot of different other management actions will flow through, and they will be less structured than before. So the ability, the pace that we've spoken about already, etc. But just the plan Bs, I think, will become far more prominent. And even considering today's call, when Sandro was not able to join, everything requires a plan B, and it's we've mocked it potentially in the past, but I think that will become more prevalent.
Right. Terry, any further thoughts?
Yeah, one follow-up question to this from some of the attendees, which is, to what extent did firms, as far as you're aware, actually have, forget plan B, how many of them actually had a plan A playbook versus how many of them just did as we just had to do with this our scenario here, just call it on the fly? And to what extent are playbooks possible, if not valuable?
Terry, would you like that one?
Well, I think people had a plan, partly because they were forced to by regulation to have some kind of BCP in place. The trouble was the plan just was nothing like what has happened, and of course it's what has happened has really made a lot of people's BCP arrangements redundant going forward. So I think the severe but plausible scenarios which the operational resilience requirements require us all to have just weren't really severe enough, despite the fact the events have shown them to have been plausible, the pandemic to have been plausible, all too plausible, unfortunately. So I think, I think people did have a plan. It wasn't up to speed. I think when I look back at what's happened, a criticism I would make of many people is that we all panicked and rushed and did kind of things in a hurry, which I also understand the reasons for why regulators, banks, firms do that as a whole. But with a bit more forward planning, perhaps the level of rushing and panicking might be less the next time, with the experience of this in our pockets.
I mean, I think one of the interesting things that we sort of talk about there is implicit in sort of saying is that people scrabbled around a bit, was a sense of people reacting to the situation and the facts as they saw them at the time. Now, you can say actually they had a miscalibrated view of the risk, and there is a real question: is what is the real risk of COVID? What's the risk of catching it? And that very much depends on personal circumstances and environment. So it's not a straightforward thing. And what I think is really interesting is that there is almost an implicit presumption that actually reacting on the fly is a bad thing. And I would argue that to a certain extent, because these things are unpredictable, actually having zero flexibility in your plan might not be sensible either. Now, there are lots of examples where you want absolute clarity, people to follow the rules. Fire, escaping a building when there's a fire. We don't want anyone getting creative and suddenly deciding to find an alternative exit. We need people to behave in a predictable, sensible manner. But I think when you've got something of this kind, particularly where there's a human component, and COVID is all around behavior, in terms of people's reaction to it, in terms of the spread of the virus, that in those sorts of circumstances, I think there needs to be a little bit of room for intelligent maneuvering and reacting to situations as they appear, particularly where you don't have the certainty. And I'm struck that when I think about risk management processes, we like to have plans A, B, C, D, whatever, everything bottomed out, so we know exactly what we'll do. And of course, that's very sensible. But if you read something like Margaret Heffernan Uncharted, which if you haven't read, thoroughly recommended, very timely book, that basically looks at it and says, the world isn't predictable, but we'd like to think it is. And I think one of the risks of having an overly codified response is that people slavishly follow and do silly things. And we've seen other examples where people have followed procedure and the procedure wasn't fit for purpose because it hadn't been designed with that situation in mind. So I would caution saying that I think we have to have plans for everything. because in this unforeseen world, there are going to be things that we can't even contemplate. And so I think having a slightly different look at resilience as well, that says, sure, certain circumstances, we know what we'll do. And there are probably some principles that we can follow. But I think there are some other pieces where one says, actually, then maybe you need some room to move, not necessarily on an individual staff member basis, but certainly for the CEO not to be sitting there going, I'm going to crack open the safe, pull out the piece of paper that tells me what to do in this circumstance, and ignore the fact that the situation isn't the one that's on the piece of paper. Because I think we sometimes fit the scenario to the solution that we've got rather than being open-minded. But I recognize there's tension on both sides. Vicky, any thoughts on that from you?
Yeah, so I think most companies have what we know as sort of minimum risk and control standards, and those would be applied. And I think in many cases, we would have found that a number of the sort of, I guess, the key controls would need to have been sidestepped during that, particularly in a remote working world. There were certain controls that were manual that could no longer be undertaken, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it's almost going back to the basics. So in all these worlds, you know, we want to have risk oversight. We need the right MI. We need to communicate appropriately. I don't think any of that is going to change. It's just how we go about doing that and the underlying data we have with which to make sure that happens appropriately. And the actual, I guess, prioritization of any of those things would alter depending on the circumstances. So I fully agree that all of those areas, you know, the policies and procedures of this world, which keep us all in a job, do need to be, you know, go back and have that review. So where you do have those standards in place, they're appropriately articulated, but they do have that level of flexibility, and also are reviewed, you know, on a reasonably regular basis to say, well, these are the fundamental things, but actually all of these other pieces flow around it, and we would pick and choose depending on the scenarios.
Terry,
I can add just one quick thing to that, if I can, which is when looking at firms' plans and arrangements for dealing with crises, there are two things you can do. You can have thresholds, triggers, and risk appetite statements that say, if this line is crossed, do X or do Y, and it's very prescriptive. Or you can have a threshold or trigger or risk appetite metric that says, if this happens, we need to have a discussion, we need to have a board meeting, we need to have, this committee needs to be called right away, and you need to have an emergency discussion. So the trigger points to a discussion rather than a specific action, bearing in mind that for those types of things that you're contemplating, a specific action in advance is not possible to be defined. So part of it is, what do you do when you hit your thresholds? What do you do when you hit a scenario that is adverse? And does it make sense trying to prescribe the action in advance, or would you at least just prescribe the governance arrangements that should kick in? And for many firms and in many situations, just describing the governance arrangements rather than the specific action sometimes helps.
I think that's a very helpful intervention. Thank you for that. Do we have anything else from the audience? Because they seem to be quite an active bunch, and I want to give them an opportunity to fire in with anything.
There are a couple of other questions. One is going back to the issue of managing staff, and there are two angles. I'll call out both questions and you can take them in turn. The first is, how do you manage your staff and make sure that they're productive and doing what they should be doing? Some firms have taken to using spyware, quote unquote, or productivity metrics and those sorts of things. And again, it's been debunked by some firms, but that's a temptation to make sure that your staff are doing what they want to do. Do you support the use of those tools? And secondly, we are human beings, last time we checked, and we like to have relationships and interactions. What does this approach, if we find it to be more effective from a profitability perspective or whatever, what does that mean for the use of these tools, whether it's Zoom or Teams or anything else, mean for the well-being from a mental perspective or psychological perspective of staff, who some of us prefer to have physical meetings where we can talk to a real individual rather than talk to machines? So one question is about cyber and cyber wars and use of spyware, and the other one is about mental well-being.
So let's take those one at a time, and I'll come to both of you on both, and we can cover this. Terry, why don't you kick us off on spyware?
Well, I think if we go back to why the question, it was about productivity, and there are other ways of measuring productivity, of course, which are to do with the outputs, the hard data, which we talked about earlier, like P&L, revenues, etc., which might which are an indicator of productivity, and don't necessarily rely the use of such tools. I think that instead of spyware, really solid management would be a good replacement. Very systematic approach to having each discussion with members of staff to cover the whole range, or the most appropriate range of management issues, which is including productivity as well as issues around well-being, psychological safety, which I think are often overlooked. You know, how many managers come and check over your psychological safety when you're in the office? They might look over your shoulder to see whether you're on Amazon or not, or do something similar to a sort of quasi-spying type scenario. But I think you have to be careful about using things like spyware, the invasion of privacy, you know, what the effects that has on the person's household, the behaviors that family may have to amend to exist in that scenario. Like, you know, my daughter has a habit of running around naked. That wouldn't be able to be she wouldn't be able to do that safely within our household, which is a safe place, if there were some kind of spying mechanism going on. So to me, it's
sitting with your back to the door, we noticed, Terry. So that was a cunning plan there.
My daughter's out today, so
double risk managed. Vicky, what are thoughts on spyware and equivalent?
I similarly have a toddler, but she's not here either, thankfully. I think so. Spyware for me, I think, is a fundamentally flawed tool, because the productivity of people in using spyware is very actually outdated. So unless you're a firm who really does work 9 to 5, and that's the hours you are required to keep, a lot of us who have children or family or older family, you know, very rarely work 9 to 5. You work until midnight, you work and, you know, work from 6 in the morning to certain times. And so who's to say you're not more productive in those times and doing those hours, etc. So I think it's flawed. So I mean, outside of the privacy piece, which is, as Terry's already discussed, I think it has a flawed aspect to it. I think it's delivery and customer happiness and the wealth and health of the individuals, employees, which is more important in terms of predictors.
And I'll echo both of those thoughts. I mean, my perspective on it simply is, what does that say about the trust that you place in your employees and how you view them? And one of the things I think is really interesting, when you look at the way companies respond to situations, and we can look at the broader COVID piece as this, is it isn't just a case of the company gets to decide what it does, and there's no response from the target audience, either employees or customers. People can see what's going on, and they can smell this stuff. And the message you're basically transmitting, if you're using spyware, is we do not trust you. And don't be surprised when that lack of trust is reciprocated by the employee. And I think one of the things that's fascinating is people think this is a one-way street. And very often with compliance and risk pieces is we do these things because we can. To which I say, just because you can doesn't mean you should. And I think there's a really interesting bit is I think there's going to be a backlash in the same way that there has been around some privacy issues for individuals from social media companies. I think there's going to be a backlash around some of this stuff, because you sit there and say, I get that you're technically allowed to do this, but actually, practically speaking, I don't like that, and that doesn't speak well, and I will behave accordingly. And if I have to work for an employer that does that, I'm going to find my own ways to kind of get control of my life again and exact it. And I suspect there's going to be all sorts of fallout that comes from it. Now, all of that said, there are situations where this is a requirement, particularly I'm thinking in banking, where trades need to be monitored and there's monitoring that goes on. But we all know that, for example, if you were engaging in something like insider dealing, but if you work at a bank, you kind of know that the first thing to do is take it off the reservation. Do not be doing it on a recorded line in a recorded situation. So there's a risk, I think, with some of these things, that all it does is it drives activity that might be on, that if people want to do it, they'll just drive it off the reservation in a way that actually, to be honest, at home, it's easier to do anyway. And you're irritating the hell out of your staff in the knowledge economy. And theoretically, you've hired them because they're smart. all of that said, I do think when it comes to things like if you've got call center operatives working at home, you are probably going to want to monitor the calls and what information they're accessing sat in an environment that's not the office. And so I think there are legitimate uses of it, but I'm really, really against this whole piece. Terry, shall we pick off the sort of any other sort of cultural thoughts around this long? I mean, you talked about the sort of you talked before about the mental health aspects. I think is it worth thinking about management and the skills that people need? And I think one of the things that's interesting is when you look at who gets promoted in organizations, particularly in financial services, let's call it out for fun. It's not often done on the basis of having amazing managerial skills. It's often done on the technical ability, the job good with clients. That doesn't necessarily translate to the sorts of skills that we potentially need now. Any thoughts on that, given the comments you've made before around psychological safety? And
yeah, I think I agree with you. I think in many industries, actually, you're promoted for having done your last job well, but not necessarily the next job. And as you get progressively more senior, management becomes a bigger and bigger part of people management becomes a bigger and bigger part of most people's jobs. So I think there will be a lot of pressure on managers going forward to perform the management function better. Certainly, I've spoken to firms who have noticed already that there are good, less good, and not good at all managers coming out of their own experience, and that will require training, and it will cover a whole range of things which managers should do, which are the organizing of teams, the organizing of the production process, if you like, for want of a better expression, the soft skills required to ensure that you have a high level of well-being in your teams, the soft skills to cultivate the right team spirit, the corporate culture that you are desiring, to set the examples which after all, we learn our culture by looking at examples. So there are a whole range of management skills, which I believe management has been an undervalued skill for some time. And I think it ought to become more valued now, and it will certainly become more important to most organizations.
Vicky, anything to add?
I think so. Certainly, this has come out of a lot of the work that we've done in sort of the championing of management. I think it's shown a lot of leaders to be human. And so when you see them in their home environment and they are maybe conducting a team meeting, and you can see that they are uncomfortable themselves, or they're, and how that has adapted and the approach has grown over the course of the last 3 months, and that they are actually human as well and have the same issues as you have, and that a lot of the non-work related issues have come out because people laugh at the fact that they have their dog snoring in the background, or their whatever it might be. All of those things come out and actually make the work life more life friendly as opposed to just work friendly. And I think that managerial skill has come out of not just managers, but actually out of all levels of individuals, and the ability to liaise with their colleagues outside of that and just to give them a call and say, how are you doing, etc. And I think that for me has been one of the key pieces that's come out.
Fabulous. We're into the last few minutes, and given I've ridden roughshod over Alessandro's prepared questions, I'm going to continue to do that. Do we have anything else from the audience
Yeah, we're going to try and take a live question if we can. I'm going to come across now to Anita. Hopefully this goes well.
Hello, Anita. This feels like a very high-risk strategy at this point.
Yeah. Okay. Well, since I can't unmute from my side, let's just continue with you, Christian, and then we can try to wrap up on time.
Okay. So look, I think we will close things out with some sort of final thoughts on what does the panel think key priorities for risk managers ought to be in this environment. We'll go to you first, Terry.
I think the management approach is going to be a key one, looking at how we come out of this with the best lessons, the best outcomes that we can, and really making a better fist of the industry going forward. I really do hope that we learn some very positive lessons from this experience, and then in future we value our ability to work from home, but also what we can learn and do with our colleagues in those moments when we're physically all together.
Fabulous. Nice uplifting message. Vicky.
I'd like to see the red tape that we've all lived by in many cases be almost moved to a red carpet, so that we can all literally, launch far more quickly towards where the vision is, regardless of what that vision might be. And I think to have that flexibility in the working environment, whether it be procedural or the working environment. Some people wish to go into the office, some people don't, etc. So I'd really like to see that continue on as we move into the next stage.
Fabulous stuff. And the wish from me, and this is shameless self-promotion, is I'd like us to focus much more on human factors. So I specialize in looking at behavioral science and how that plays into risk. And we've talked on some of the topics where really human reaction to things can make things a damn sight better or a damn sight worse. And so I think that human factor, in a world where everybody has been talking about automation and artificial intelligence and robotics, all very, very important stuff, I think what we've seen in this crisis has been human brilliance and human utter stupidity. And I'll leave you to decide which high-profile examples I'm choosing for both categories. But I think, to my mind, that's a key piece here. And ultimately, this disease is all around people. And so my hope is that we start to think a little bit more around that, and we can get out of being formulaic and bureaucratic and much more human in the way that we respond to things. So I think that leaves us just about 30 seconds short. You can see all of our names in the invites. I will speak on behalf of my colleagues. I'm sure to say if anybody wishes to connect with any of us, you will be able to find us on your social media networks of choice. You can obviously get in touch via the Institute. On behalf of Alessandro, who was unfortunately unable to make it to join us, I hope he's not too disappointed with the way we answered the questions. I hope you found this useful. Thank you so much for joining us, and for so many of you to be on the line. It's been an absolute pleasure. So goodbye from me, and no doubt goodbye from the other panelists.
Thank you.
Bye. Goodbye.